in her 2011 documentary, Forgiveness, A Time to Love and a Time to Hate, Helen Whitney provides, as PBS notes, an intimate look into the spontaneous outpouring of forgiveness. From the Amish families for the 2006 shooting of their children in Nickel Mines, Pennsylvania, the struggle of 60s radicals to cope with the serious consequences of their violent acts of protest, the shattering of a family after the mother abandons them only to return seeking forgiveness, the legacy and divisiveness of apartheid and the aftermath of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission hearings in South Africa, the penitential journey of modern-day Germany, confronting the horrific acts of the Holocaust, and the riveting stories of survivors of the unimaginably brutal Rwandan genocide. The program description notes, once a uniquely religious word, forgiveness now is changing, and there is no consensus about what it is and what it is becoming. Forgiveness is complicated. Say someone cannot remember the harm they inflicted. Should they ask to be forgiven? Or if they know they hurt someone, should they have the right to set the terms of how reconciliation can happen? And what about acts so egregious that forgiveness would imply complicity? However you define forgiveness, its power is real, and never more so when it struggles with the unforgivable. In few places in the Bible is the power of a changed heart and deep reconciliation and forgiveness more palpable than in the Old Testament story of Joseph. The backstory that leads to our scripture lesson this day is likely one of the best known stories of family unrest in the Bible. Joseph, a bratty little brother, his father's favorite because he was the son of Jacob's old age. His father suited it up with a coat of many colors, the Technicolor dream coat. And this fried his brothers, who could not stand the arrogant kid. But they had to admit that he was awfully precocious. He not only had big visionary dreams, but he waited no time at all to share them with his brothers and probably anyone else who would hear him out. Imagine what it would have been like to have been the arrogant, non-stop talker kid, share with his brothers a dream he had the night before. In the dream, Joseph stands over his brothers and they're groveling before him. We can imagine that this kind of thing went on for quite a while, and after so much of it, they just had it. Their first move was to plot Joseph's demise. Let's throw him in a pit and bring his bloodied coat back to our father, Jacob, saying a wild animal got to him. But then one of the brothers thought better of it. He suggested they sell him as a slave. And so when some Midianites happened by on the road, they bought him and took him back to Egypt. Well, you likely remember the rest. Joseph eventually wound up in charge of his master's house. He was in a seductive harassment situation with his master's wife and was jailed by false accusations. While he was in jail, someone discovered that Joseph not only had fantastical dreams of his own, but he also had the uncanny ability to interpret others' dreams. So when the Pharaoh, who was having a recurring dream over many months, the word came to him that a Hebrew slave could interpret them. The Pharaoh called for Joseph to come, hear the dream, and interpret it. When he did, Pharaoh was very impressed. And from there, Joseph advanced through the government ranks and eventually oversaw the securing of food for Egypt in anticipation of a famine. And when the famine came over all the earth, Jacob, Joseph's papa, sent 10 of his sons to buy food in Egypt. And that closes in on today's scene. The brothers come to buy food, and they wind up standing at Joseph's feet. Now, they don't recognize him. Joseph recognizes them, however, and sets about giving them a hard time, having a little bit of payback. And when the 10 are standing in front of him, Joseph inquires if the whole family is present. And the brother admits that one of their kin being dead and another younger son back home with Papa. Joseph sends them back to fetch his brother Benjamin, who happens to be Joseph's full brother. And when the brothers tell Jacob that in order to get food in Egypt, they have to return with the young one, Benjamin, it nearly sends a shriek of terror through Jacob. But he consents to send him. And so the brothers return to Egypt, and when they come before Joseph again, they still don't recognize him. And now all of the brothers stand before him, all 11 of them. And this is when the grand epiphany arrives. It's evident that Joseph was playing them to some extent by withholding his identity when it came to Egypt earlier. He saw his kin groveling before him as he had seen in a dream. And we realize that Joseph could, with one wave of his hand, snuff out the life or the liberty of all of the other sons of Jacob, as his 11 brothers stood before him. As the text says, Joseph could not control himself any longer. With weeping, with a longing burning in his very bones that must have overtaken his anger at them, with his brothers in front of him, Joseph asked that the doors be closed, that the government officials step away. And then, with eyes on those who wanted to kill him and instead sold him as a slave, he reveals himself to them. Unable to hold his emotion, he cries out and says to them, "I am Joseph." And with this stunning disclosure, the world that Joseph's brothers inhabit is irreversibly shattered. His brothers are rendered silent, no response. They may have assumed they were done for. They may have assumed that they'd be hauled out on an attempted murder charges. But Joseph does not act from the past, but instead breaks with the past. He offers an alternative future and new possibilities that come from God alone, not from the contrition of the brothers, whose name means one added by God, gives a surplus of meaning and joy and hope to the family that came hungry and leave filled to the brim. It is the power of God who changes things. Newness of sight and life arrives when we let go and trust in God. Joseph gets up close with his brothers, and we see in his action the power to create newness comes not from detachment, but from risky, self-disclosing engagement. And I don't get the sense that Joseph had dreamed up the steps he would take to engage his brothers. It seems that even Joseph might have been surprised by his admission that this was a God thing. But I am sure that there are many times in our lives when we find ourselves stepping across the chasm of fear, of anger, of resentment to holy meeting, the holiest meeting of a broken heart knit back together to wholeness by the presence of the living God. So we might begin right here and right now and quietly and honestly ask whether there is someone in our circle of friends or family that we've not forgiven for a wrong that person may have done to us. Is there someone we have separated ourselves from in anger, maybe quiet bitterness, as Dietrich Bonhoeffer says. It is the case that it is often the case that we bury our anger, our hurt, our discord, and in weeks or months or years that ensue, the wound festers and infects other relationships. But in our humanity, we are wired to want for nothing more than to forgive and to be forgiven, to have that which was broken made whole. What is clear by this story is that the newness of life, the God-given abundant life that is promised to each and every one of us, is not a glib, oh whatever kind of abundance. It dares to come close, though, to weep, to hold the door open to the real desire for newness. There are many aspects or ways one might forgive, and many more ways that one might be forgiven. But the one that is at the heart of the Jacob story is the new beginning. Though I'm a great believer in therapy and find power of insight that arises from exploring the past and its power in our lives in the present, I am quite sure that the implied direction of the text of the power of God to hold open a new narrative, the narrative of working towards a common future together. Isn't that what Joseph did with his brothers? He shut the door to his role as a lord in the empire and opened the door to the relationship with his brothers. It is God that creates real newness, and it comes unexpectedly and doesn't linger to explain how it happens, but simply relishes the wonder of it all. Forgiveness not only arises in moments of individual reckoning, but it comes in the corporate context as well. When politics and economics set up systems that harm groups of people, it takes years to create the possibility of new beginnings. For example, we see in the aftermath of apartheid in South Africa, which affected so many in that country, just as the stain of racism in this country continues to affect each and every one of us every day. Often small efforts to undo the ongoing systems of injustice and hurt are dismissed as doing little to address the political and social wreckage that results from overt racism or sexist or abusive practice. But there are places where this is going on. For example, about 20 years ago in Cape Town, South Africa, Father Michael Lapsey and 20 or so black, brown, and white South African people who, in a back room of a school, gathered to tell stories of their experiences of violation, loss, fear, and brokenness that resulted from the system of racism and separation during apartheid. Father Lapsley, our Anglican priest, led the discussion of part of the organization called the Institute for the Healing of Memories. He himself had been a victim of violence while a chaplain to the range of universities in South Africa, and an unrelenting voice for dismantling apartheid. He'd received a letter bomb in a church tract delivered to his mailbox, and when he opened his tract, both of his hands were blown off and he lost an eye. So how did this priest move from the physical and emotional trauma to establishing the Institute for the Healing of Memories? Father Lapsley said much later, quite early on after the bomb, I realized that if I was filled with hatred and a desire for revenge, I'd be a victim forever. If we have something done to us, we are victims. If we physically survive, we are survivors. Sadly, many people never travel any further than this. He goes on, in 1992, I returned to South Africa to find a nation of survivors, but a damaged nation. Everyone had a story, a truth to tell. In his work, he developed this program called The Healing of Memories, The workshops explore the effects of South Africa's past at an emotional, psychological, and spiritual level, as those who have suffered struggle to have their stories recognized. He tries to support them through storytelling, engaged trust, and silent no more. The power of healing, the power of God's strengthening comes forth through real people in real time. Father Lapsley's work is not a sweet, quiet forgiveness that overlooks the tragedy, the violence, and the upending of life itself. Rather, his activity relies on God to change the equation for us, to bring together what is new for the sake of something larger, something huge, something monumental, the very shaping of our future as the human project on this planet. It is also in Jesus' word to love our enemies and pray for those who persecute us. And Jesus' words in these very complicated times are very challenging to us, because it seems that the whole human project veers very close to the brink. When we work so hard for justice or peace or reconciliation in family, in our neighborhoods, in this country, and with the environment, we have the power to shift the equation. When the culprit whom we believe has harmed us is standing before us or shows up on our news feed or on our Facebook, we, like Joseph, can turn from the old ways, the familiar ways, into new and unfamiliar resolve with God's urgent and divine desire for fullness of life. Our love for enemy changes us. The power of such love changed Joseph, can change us as well. Where does such a vision for undoing the raging conflicts that reside within us and our world come from? It comes from a tenacious counter-affirmation, which is God's purpose, utterly gracious. It comes about with the doors shut on the powers that we assume will make real change, the empires. It comes in the face-to-face encounter of 12 brothers in a palace, one of whom washes the hurt with his tears and finally comes home, truly home to the land of promise. And the cloak that he donned, that coat of many colors that he rubbed in his brother's face, became a garment of grace, a mantle of gladness, tenaciously binding them together in such harmony and joy that life awakened anew. My friends, this is the glorious news of our God. It is good news. It is challenging news. And it is for each and every one of us. Thanks be to God. Amen.